They were legends of the stage and screen, revered, knighted, worshipped. But behind the velvet curtains and clipped accents lurked a very different truth. They swore like dockworkers, terrorized crews, and turned sets into psychological minefields. These weren't just great actors. They were walking tempests, wrapped in tweed and ego. Some were feared, some were hated, all were unforgettable. This isn't a tribute. It's a guided tour through the glorious, foul-mouthed chaos of 21 of Britain's most volatile stars. Brace yourself. The spotlight doesn't just reveal talent, it exposes temperament. Before we dive headfirst into the profanity and brilliance, make sure you're subscribed. This channel unearths the untold stories behind the legends, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. And while you're here, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your city in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. Midnight? Lunch break? Somewhere in between? Let's see who's watching this madness at 3 a.m. 1. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed didn't walk onto film sets. He detonated onto them. The man didn't act. He erupted. Described by more than one shell-shocked crew member as a walking pub brawl with sideburns, Reed's legacy is carved somewhere between myth and workplace hazard. He was the kind of actor whose presence could clear a room, or fill it with fear, laughter, or beer, depending on his mood that hour. Known for treating co-stars, directors, and entire film crews like members of a personal drinking challenge, Reed's legendary volatility wasn't just a footnote in his career. It was the story. There are tales of him showing up on set, roaring drunk, issuing Shakespearean insults with one breath and hurling furniture with the next. Once, on a shoot in Spain, he allegedly turned a hotel lobby into a gladiator arena after being told the bar was closed. Another time, he challenged a journalist to a fistfight in the middle of an interview. That was a good day. Yet directors kept hiring him. Why? Because when the cameras rolled, Reed was magnetic, dangerously, disturbingly brilliant. There was genius in the madness, and everyone knew it. The trick was surviving long enough to capture it on film. Off camera, though, Reed treated human interaction like a sport, and profanity like punctuation. His tirades weren't just frequent, they were symphonic. He didn't just swear, he composed obscenity. Still, there's something almost tragic about it. Beneath the bravado, the storms, and the smashed glasses was a man desperately wrestling with his own legend, chasing something he could never quite catch. Respect, maybe, or peace, or just the silence between applause. But if Reed was the hurricane, the next man was the thunder that rolled in afterward, cold, articulate, and just as capable of blowing the roof off a set. 2. Richard Burton. If Oliver Reed was the rowdy chaos of the pub, Richard Burton was the slow-burning menace sitting in the corner with a bottle of scotch and a Shakespeare sonnet, ready to verbally eviscerate you in iambic pentameter. His voice could melt stone, his temper could set it on fire. Burton's fury was surgical. He didn't yell, he incinerated. Colleagues described the experience of being dressed down by him as elegantly traumatic. One co-star said it was like being insulted by the ghost of Hamlet, but with more alcohol and less mercy. Whether it was exhaustion, genius, or the gallons of booze, Burton seemed to operate on a thin thread of patience, one that snapped often, loudly, and with great theatrical flair. There are tales of directors fleeing set, scripts being hurled across rooms, and scenes halted mid-shot because Burton decided the lighting was insulting to the craft. But perhaps more disorienting than his rages were the moods that preceded them. Long, sullen silences, followed by sudden bursts of dazzling wit or ice-cold sarcasm. He wasn't unpredictable. He was inevitable. And yet, as with Reed, Burton was undeniably brilliant. You couldn't look away. He brought a kind of haunted intensity to every role, his demons somehow lending gravity to every line. And perhaps that was the problem. He didn't perform emotion, he bled it. On stage, on film, and behind the scenes. There was a cruelty to his greatness, a sharpness that cut everyone around him, including himself. As his drinking deepened, so did the verbal lashings, more frequent, more brutal. He made genius look exhausting and cruelty seem poetic. And if you think that's a contradiction, get ready for the man who practically made contradiction an Olympic sport. And if you're still here after that, clearly you've got a taste for brilliance laced with chaos. Just our kind of viewer. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We dig up the stories most people politely ignore. Also, let's make this interesting. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you in bed, pretending to sleep? Or stuck at work, deep in a rabbit hole? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who else is wide awake at ungodly hours listening to old actors verbally combust. 3. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole didn't burn bridges. He flambéed them with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a quote from Euripides in the other. To call him difficult is like calling Everest a bit steep. He was charming, dazzling, and utterly terrifying. He could walk into a rehearsal and turn it into a masterclass or a massacre, depending on how many drinks he'd had and how much sleep you valued. He was once described as the only man who could insult you in 6 languages before lunch and somehow make you thank him for the lesson. At his best, O'Toole was an electric current, beautiful, dangerous, and best handled with gloves. At his worst, he made grown men cry. Not out of fear necessarily, though there was plenty of that, but from the sheer intensity of his contempt when something or someone disappointed him. Directors told stories of O'Toole arriving late, reciting full monologues perfectly, then immediately tearing them apart with drunken improvisation. He'd argue with scripts, with blocking, with reality itself if he felt it wasn't up to his standards. And yet, everyone kept trying to work with him. Why? Because even when he was impossible, he was also irreplaceable. The camera didn't just love him. It surrendered to him. But unlike Reed's fire or Burton's ice, O'Toole was a tempest. He enjoyed the chaos. He fed on it. He turned every set into a stage, and every stage into a battlefield. And if you didn't keep up, you were either trampled or forgotten. He made greatness look like a dare. And if you think a storm like O'Toole couldn't be matched by cold, silent steel, well, you haven't met the man who hated being called Obi-Wan. 4. Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness is remembered as serenity in tweed, a soft voice, a gentle smile, the kindly elder statesman of British acting, which is exactly why people who actually worked with him tended to flinch slightly when his name came up. Because behind that monkish calm lived a man with the emotional temperature of a locked freezer and a talent for making people feel very small without ever raising his voice. Guinness didn't rage, he didn't shout, he withdrew. And in British culture that can be far more lethal. Colleagues recalled him as impeccably polite, devastatingly dismissive, and quietly contemptuous of anything, or anyone, he deemed beneath him. Fans? He famously loathed them. Autographs were granted like charitable donations, often with visible irritation, as if admiration were an inconvenience interrupting his real work. Judging you. On set, his displeasure arrived not as profanity, but as precision. A pause that lasted too long, a look that stripped confidence, a comment delivered gently, almost kindly, that somehow stayed with you for years. One actor said being criticized by Guinness felt like being politely erased. No swearing required. The damage was surgical. He was also deeply conflicted about fame itself, resenting roles that made him beloved while privately scorning the attention they brought. That resentment leaked outward. Crew members spoke of a chilly distance, a refusal to engage, an air of superiority that could turn collaboration into quiet humiliation. He wasn't abusive in the traditional sense. He was disapproving. And that, in a hierarchical industry, carried real weight. Yet Guinness was brilliant, Meticulous. Intellectually formidable. He believed acting was a discipline, not a playground, and he had little patience for ego, enthusiasm, or warmth if it disrupted the work. Unfortunately, his definition of the work often included reminding others that they were not him. If Reed was chaos and Burton was fire, Guinness was frost. And frost, given enough time, cracks stone. But the next man on this list did the opposite. He didn't freeze rooms. He filled them with noise, confidence, and a mouth that moved faster than diplomacy ever could. 5. Michael Caine, early career. Before Michael Caine became everyone's favorite wise uncle of cinema, he was something else entirely. Sharp-edged, hyper-alert, and deeply aware that he had clawed his way into a world that did not expect him to be there. And insecurity, when mixed with ambition, often comes out sounding like arrogance. In his early career, Caine had a reputation for being blunt to the point of abrasion. He didn't suffer fools, real or imagined, and he didn't soften his language to spare feelings. Crew members described him as demanding, impatient, and occasionally explosive when things didn't move fast enough or meet his standards. He wasn't cruel for sport, but he was ruthless about time, respect, and professionalism. And if he thought you were wasting any of those, you heard about it. Unlike the aristocratic chill of Guinness, Caine's sharpness was street level. Direct. Profane when irritated. He'd grown up fighting for space, and he wasn't about to pretend the industry was a gentleman's club. That attitude rubbed plenty of people the wrong way, especially in a system still dominated by class and quiet deference. He challenged directors. He snapped at inefficiency. He carried himself like someone who knew this might all disappear tomorrow. To his credit, Caine mellowed. Fame stabilized him. Success softened the edges. He's been open about how age, security, and perspective sanded down the volatility. But in those early years, he was all elbows, pushing forward, daring anyone to tell him he didn't belong. And that tension, between raw talent and raw nerves, made him formidable. But it also made him difficult. Because hunger doesn't always look noble. Sometimes it looks like impatience, sharp words, and a fuse that burns just a bit too fast. If Caine was ambition still on fire, the next man was something else entirely. An emotional landmine. Quiet one moment, explosive the next. And when Albert Finney went off, nobody mistook it for passion. 6. Albert Finney. Albert Finney had a smile that suggested warmth and eyes that warned you not to test it. He was famously private, fiercely talented, and, according to many who worked with him, capable of erupting without warning. Not theatrically, not poetically, just suddenly, sharply, and with language that left rooms stunned into silence. Finney's volatility wasn't constant. It was unpredictable. That was the problem. One moment he was collaborative, generous, even funny. The next, he'd snap, unleashing a barrage of profanity over something as small as a missed cue or a technical delay. Crew members learned to read the air around him, to sense when the pressure was building. Sometimes it still didn't help. Unlike Reed or O'Toole, Finney wasn't performing chaos. He despised nonsense. He hated waste, and when he felt the work was being compromised, his reaction was swift and unsparing. Directors spoke of him as both a dream and a nightmare, astonishing on camera, terrifying when displeased. He didn't posture. He didn't bluff. When he was angry, you knew it immediately. There was also pride. Finney famously rejected honors and titles, and that stubborn independence bled into his behavior on set. He didn't want to be managed. He didn't want to be smoothed over. And he certainly didn't want to be told how to feel about the work. That refusal to bend made him magnetic and combustible. Yet, like so many on this list, his explosions coexisted with extraordinary depth. Finney didn't phone performances in. He attacked them. He demanded intensity because he gave intensity. Unfortunately, everyone nearby paid the price when the engine overheated. And if Finney's temper felt like a sudden detonation, The next man lived closer to the blast radius permanently, a figure so drenched in rage, drink, and legend that even his friends admitted he could be unbearable. 7. Richard Harris. Richard Harris didn't have a temper so much as a weather system. When he entered a room, the atmosphere changed. Barometric pressure dropped. People braced. He was brilliant, charismatic, generous, poetic, and capable of turning venomous without much warning, especially once drink entered the equation. And drink, with Harris, was never a footnote. It was a co-star. Friends, enemies, and biographers all agree on one thing. Harris could be unbearable. Not always, not even most of the time. But when he was legendary. His verbal cruelty didn't come from calculation. It came from impulse. He lashed out the way others breathed. Profanity poured from him not as aggression, but as overflow, a torrent of frustration, ego, insecurity, and wounded pride. On set, Harris could be magnetic 1 hour and corrosive the next. He'd charm a room into loving him, then tear someone apart with a single sentence that hit far too close to home. Crew members learned quickly that admiration did not equal safety. In fact, it sometimes made things worse. He despised sycophancy, but he also despised indifference. Navigating his moods required instinct, not logic. What made it more complicated was that Harris knew he could be awful. He admitted it. He joked about it. He even apologized, sometimes sincerely, sometimes theatrically. But awareness didn't stop the behavior. It only added another layer of tragedy to it. He was a man painfully aware of his own excesses and seemingly powerless, or unwilling, to restrain them. Yet directors kept calling. Audiences kept watching, because Harris brought danger to his performances. You believed him because he was volatile. There was no acting around the edges. When he was furious, it was real. When he was tender, it felt earned. He burned through goodwill the way he burned through whiskey, but the flame was hypnotic. And still, for all that noise, Harris was obvious. Loud. Impossible to ignore. The next man on this list was the opposite. A master of elegance whose cruelty came not in storms, but in sentences so perfectly phrased they left no visible wound, only lasting damage. 8. John Gielgud. John Gielgud could devastate you with impeccable diction. No shouting, no theatrics. Just a line, delivered calmly, that made you question your intelligence, your talent, and possibly your right to be in the room. He didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. His authority did the work for him. Revered as one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of all time, Gielgud carried that reverence like a blade. When displeased, he didn't explode, he condescended. And for young actors, especially, that could be crushing. A single withering remark from him could linger longer than a month of rehearsals. People didn't fear his temper, they feared his disappointment. Accounts from colleagues describe a man capable of immense kindness, but equally capable of icy humiliation. If he felt standards were slipping, or that someone hadn't done the work, his response was swift and merciless, delivered with a smile, a pause, and language so refined it almost sounded like encouragement. Almost. He believed deeply in discipline, in tradition, in the sanctity of craft, and anyone who violated those ideals became fair game. Gielgud didn't tolerate sloppiness, ego, or what he perceived as mediocrity. Unfortunately, his definition of mediocrity could be expansive. His criticism wasn't loud enough to cause a scene, but it was quiet enough to be remembered forever. What made his sharpness especially potent was contrast. The public saw grace, the voice, the legend. Behind closed doors, some encountered a man who could reduce colleagues to silence with a sentence that landed like a verdict. He wasn't cruel for entertainment. He was cruel because he believed it was necessary. And that belief, that art justified emotional collateral damage, was shared by the next man. except where Gielgud cut with elegance. This one dominated with force. If Gielgud was the judge, the next actor was the general. 9. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier didn't just command respect, he expected it immediately, without negotiation. He was brilliance incarnate, and he knew it. On set and on stage, he operated from the assumption that everyone else should rise to his level or get out of the way. And if they failed to do so, he made sure they felt it. Olivier's reputation for domineering behavior wasn't born of rumor. It was forged in rehearsal rooms thick with tension. He barked orders. He interrupted performances. He corrected colleagues publicly. Younger actors in particular often found themselves on the receiving end of cutting remarks disguised as instruction. He believed pressure created excellence. What it also created was fear. He could be profane when frustrated, sharp when challenged, and dismissive when bored. There was little patience for dissent. Olivier didn't collaborate so much as orchestrate, and if the orchestra faltered, he reminded them who held the baton. Directors weren't immune either. His status gave him power, and he used it freely. Yet, like so many tyrants of talent, he justified everything through results. And the results were undeniable. His performances were monumental. His influence reshaped British theatre. He carried the weight of genius, and expected others to carry it too, whether they were built for it or not. What made Olivier especially difficult was his certainty. He wasn't lashing out from insecurity or chaos. He was enforcing a hierarchy, and in that hierarchy, he was the sun everything else orbited. To disappoint him was to fail publicly. To challenge him was to invite humiliation. But if Olivier ruled through authority, the next man ruled through cruelty sharpened by sarcasm. A bully by reputation, feared not for genius, but for how eagerly he used his tongue as a weapon. 10. Trevor Howard. Trevor Howard carried bitterness like a tailored suit, always present, perfectly fitted, and impossible to ignore. Where others on this list were volatile, theatrical, or conflicted, Howard was something colder and more corrosive, openly contemptuous. He didn't lose his temper so much as deploy it, and those on the receiving end rarely forgot it. Howard's reputation as a bully wasn't born from a handful of bad days. It was sustained, repeated, and quietly acknowledged across decades of British film and theatre. Crew members described him as openly rude, dismissive of anyone he deemed beneath him, and aggressively sarcastic in a way that felt less like wit and more like punishment. He didn't shout to intimidate. He sneered. He cut. He humiliated. There was little romance to it, no tortured genius mythology. Howard wasn't drinking himself into chaos or wrestling with demons in public view. He simply seemed to enjoy dominance. Younger actors were frequent targets, corrected sharply, mocked casually, made examples of. Mistakes were not teaching moments. They were opportunities. And Howard took them. What made him especially difficult was consistency. With some men, you waited out the storm. With Howard, the storm was the climate. You didn't hope for a better mood. You learned to endure the existing one. Directors often tolerated it because he delivered precisely what was required on camera. Off camera, though, the damage accumulated quietly. There was also an air of resentment around him, toward the industry, toward changing tastes, toward people who didn't seem to earn their place. That resentment curdled into cruelty. And unlike others who later expressed regret or softened with age, Howard's reputation never truly mellowed. He remained, to many, a man who made sets smaller, colder, and far less humane. Yet even he wasn't the most tyrannical presence British cinema endured, because the next man didn't just belittle people, he ruled them, loudly, emotionally, and with a taste for psychological pressure that left no room for dignity. 11. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton was a giant in every sense, physically imposing, vocally thunderous, and emotionally overwhelming. When he entered a room, he didn't just occupy space, he claimed it. And for those working under him, that presence could feel less like inspiration and more like suffocation. Laughton's temper was notorious. He could be charming, jovial, even paternal, until something displeased him. Then the charm vanished. In its place came biting sarcasm, public dressing downs, and an atmosphere thick with tension. Crew members spoke of walking on eggshells, never quite sure which version of Laughton they'd encounter that day. What distinguished Laughton from others on this list was his emotional manipulation. He didn't just express displeasure, he performed it. He used mood, silence, and sudden intensity to control rooms. Actors described feeling psychologically battered after rehearsals, not because of volume, but because of sustained pressure. He could make you doubt yourself slowly, methodically, until confidence drained away. His cruelty wasn't constant, but it was theatrical. He knew when an audience was watching. He knew when humiliation would land hardest. And he wasn't shy about using it. Directors often found themselves managing not just a production, but Laughton's emotional gravity, trying to keep everyone else intact while orbiting him. And yet the industry excused much of it. Because Laughton was extraordinary. His performances were fearless, grotesque, tender, and unforgettable. He transformed himself completely, and that transformation came at a cost, often paid by those around him. He believed great art demanded discomfort. That pressure forged excellence. What he rarely acknowledged was how much wreckage it left behind. But even Laughton's tyrannical storms would eventually look tame compared to the man who followed. A figure remembered fondly today, but whose early years were marked by control, authority, and a voice that brooked no disagreement. 12. Richard Attenborough, early years. Richard Attenborough's later reputation as cinema's kindly moral compass has a way of rewriting history. But early in his career, long before the grandfatherly warmth and humanitarian image, Attenborough was something far sterner, authoritarian, demanding, and sharply intolerant of resistance. In his younger years, Attenborough was known for running sets like military operations. He believed discipline was non-negotiable, and when standards weren't met, his response could be swift and verbally severe. Crew members recalled sharp reprimands delivered without softness, corrections issued publicly, and an expectation of obedience that left little room for discussion. He wasn't profane for sport, but he wasn't gentle either. His frustrations surfaced as clipped commands, cutting remarks, and an unmistakable sense that he was in charge, and that questioning him was a mistake. This was a man who believed in hierarchy, structure, and authority, and he enforced it. What complicates Attenborough's place on this list is growth. Unlike many others, he evolved. Age, reflection, and success reshaped him. The iron edge softened. The voice warmed. He became known for empathy and patience. But in those early decades, working under him could feel rigid, even oppressive. The pressure was constant, the tolerance for error minimal. He demanded loyalty and commitment because he gave both, yet the imbalance of power meant not everyone experienced that exchange as fair. Some thrived under his leadership, others felt steamrolled by it. Attenborough's transformation is important because it reminds us these reputations were not static. People change, some learn, some don't, and some, like the next man, remained unpredictable until the very end, oscillating between kindness and verbal savagery with terrifying speed. 13. Ralph Richardson. Ralph Richardson was a contradiction in a cravat. Kind one day, caustic the next, and never quite as harmless as his soft-spoken public image suggested. He didn't fit the mold of a tyrant, or a drunk, or a bully, but if you worked with him, you learned quickly. Richardson didn't need volume to devastate. His weapon was unpredictability, and it kept entire rooms on edge. He could be delightfully warm. He could also be ferociously impatient. Crew members often described the discomfort of rehearsals derailed by sudden outbursts, moments when something minor, A lighting delay or a flubbed line triggered explosions of anger that felt wildly out of proportion. The air would turn cold, the charm would vanish, and what followed was pure pressure, laced with sudden profanity and unmistakable disdain. The problem was that Richardson didn't look like a man who'd tear you down. He had the air of a kindly uncle, which somehow made the explosions worse. One co-star described it as being hit by a storm in a teacup. Unexpected, strangely elegant, and completely terrifying. When he lost his temper, it was theatrical and biting. When he regained it, he often acted as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't just anger that made him difficult. It was his mood swings, emotional weather that could shift by the hour. He'd be affectionate in the morning, vicious by lunch, and reflective by dinner. And through it all, he delivered extraordinary performances, commanding respect even as he tested it. Richardson left behind a complex legacy, a man whose genius flickered through flashes of humanity and sudden cruelties, often in the same scene. And if his volatility was hard to track, the next name on our list was easier to define. He didn't try to mask his disdain. He wore it openly, with a voice like sandpaper and a smirk that dared you to like him. 14. Donald Sutherland, UK-based classic era. Donald Sutherland didn't just appear in a room, he assessed it. From the moment he stepped on a set, you got the feeling he'd already made up his mind about everyone in it. There was a stillness to him, but it wasn't peace. It was judgment. Cold, clinical, and often laced with a sarcasm that could ruin your whole week. During his UK-based classic era, especially in the 1970s and early 80s, Sutherland developed a quiet but persistent reputation for being difficult. Not in the explosive scenery-chewing way of some of his peers. No, Sutherland was sharper than that. His contempt came in small doses, the raised eyebrow, the dry remark, the silence that lasted a beat too long. Directors found him brilliant but dismissive. Crew members found him aloof, sometimes icy. Actors, especially younger ones, described a sense of being tolerated more than engaged. What made it worse was how perceptive he was. Sutherland had a radar for weakness, for pretense, for anything less than total competence. If you didn't impress him, he wouldn't say so directly. But he'd let you know, in tone, in posture, in precisely phrased comments that sounded polite, until you replayed them in your head and realized you'd been dressed down with surgical elegance. And yet, his performances were undeniably magnetic. That same cold edge that unsettled coworkers gave his characters weight, danger, depth. He didn't warm sets, but he elevated them. The challenge was surviving the chill. It's worth noting that many who worked with him also praised his intelligence, his wit, his professionalism. But admiration and comfort are not the same thing. Sutherland brought the former, rarely the latter. And if Sutherland kept people at a distance through sharp intellect, the next man on our list built walls of icy silence, private to the point of isolation, and known for making sets feel like places you weren't entirely welcome to exist. 15. Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde was a man of shadows, elegant, refined, and almost entirely unknowable. He didn't explode, he didn't threaten, he simply withheld. Emotion, warmth, conversation. For many who worked with him, that was enough to make him one of the most unsettling figures in British film. Bogarde's reputation for coldness wasn't loud. It was whispered, confirmed quietly by crew members and co-stars who recounted his aloofness, his sudden chill, his habit of making people feel like intruders in his world. He was intensely private, almost obsessively so, and that privacy often manifested as emotional distance. He rarely mingled. He didn't do small talk, and if he didn't respect you, he didn't pretend otherwise. When he did speak, he could be brutally cutting. His remarks were precise, acidic, and delivered in the same velvet voice that made him a cinematic icon. There was no bluster, just a calm, devastating sense of superiority. Co-workers often left conversations with him feeling smaller, unsure whether they'd been dismissed or quietly dissected. This wasn't the coldness of a tyrant, it was the coldness of a locked room. Bogarde had no interest in being liked. He had even less interest in explaining himself. And that, in a collaborative medium like film, made him one of the most difficult personalities to navigate. Some directors learned to give him distance. Others clashed with him outright. Still, his performances were mesmerizing. That sense of internal conflict, of something hidden just beneath the surface, was very real. Because Bogarde was hiding something, his emotions, his anger, his vulnerability. And that repression, that tightly controlled facade, made his roles unforgettable. But if Bogarde's ice was controlled and quiet, the next man on our list handled difficulty with a far heavier hand, loud, raw, and prone to confrontation, especially once the drinks started flowing. 16. Stanley Baker. Stanley Baker didn't walk into a scene, he took possession of it. He had the face of a man who knew how to win a fight, and the temperament of someone who didn't mind starting one either. On screen, he was the brooding enforcer of British cinema, quietly dangerous, constantly smoldering. Off-screen, that smolder often turned to fire, particularly when someone tested his patience, his authority, or his pride. Known for his working-class roots and refusal to play nice with the posh crowd that dominated British theater at the time, Baker carried a chip on his shoulder the size of a film reel. And when that chip was knocked, usually by incompetence or delay, things got loud. The man could swear like he was writing his own dictionary, and he often did so in the middle of set disputes that left crew members stunned into silence. He was also a perfectionist. That didn't mean he was polite about it. Mistakes annoyed him, egos enraged him. And delays? Those were a personal insult. Actors who flubbed lines near him usually didn't flub them twice. He didn't just correct people, he corrected them loudly in front of everyone. But his aggression came with purpose. He wasn't difficult just to be difficult. He demanded intensity because he brought it. Every scene, every shoot. He believed in grit, in realism, in giving everything you had, whether you were behind the camera or in front of it. He wasn't there to be liked. He was there to make something unforgettable. And sometimes that meant leaving bruises, emotional, reputational, or otherwise. Still, as rough as Baker could be, the next man's cruelty had a polish to it. Because when James Mason turned on you, it wasn't rage, it was elegance sharpened into a blade. 17. James Mason. James Mason was elegance personified, cool, articulate, devastating. If Stanley Baker roared, Mason whispered. And somehow that whisper carried just as much threat. He didn't need to raise his voice to make a room go quiet. He didn't need to explode to make someone feel small. He just needed a single sentence, perfectly timed, dry as dust, and twice as cutting. By all accounts, Mason was a master of restraint. That made his moments of disdain all the more chilling. When irritated, and it didn't take much, he could be casually cruel in a way that felt almost surgical. Colleagues often didn't realize they'd been insulted until a few moments later. One director called it death by grammar. What made Mason particularly difficult was his tendency to hold himself, and everyone else, to quietly unreachable standards. He didn't bark at people. He simply let them know they had disappointed him. And sometimes that was worse. A sarcastic aside, a look of amused contempt, a politely phrased observation that left you questioning your career choices. He was capable of great warmth, but it came with conditions: competence, intelligence, professionalism. Fall short, and he wouldn't shout. He'd disappear behind that cold smile. Still, his intelligence was magnetic. Directors tolerated his iciness because he delivered depth on screen that few could match. His characters were layered, brooding, full of hidden wounds. Maybe because he understood what it was like to hide disdain behind charm. Or maybe he just enjoyed the power of silence in a room full of people desperate to please him. But if Mason sliced you with charm, the next man on this list made no such effort. He shouted, he slammed, he exploded. Alan Bates didn't come to set to intimidate. He just did it naturally, often without even realizing. 18. Alan Bates. Alan Bates had the face of a romantic lead and the temperament of a man trying very hard not to punch the wall. He was magnetic, physically intense, and known for performances that bled emotion, but that intensity didn't stay in character. It leaked onto sets, into green rooms, all over the nerves of whoever happened to be within shouting distance. Bates was not known for constant rage, but for sudden rage. That was the real danger. Everything would seem calm until it wasn't. Someone missed a cue, a camera setup dragged too long, a prop was out of place. Then the voice would rise, sharp and vicious, and for a moment, the charming actor became a storm in human form. It wasn't just anger, it was frustration at the process. Bates cared deeply about the work, obsessively even. He wanted truth, authenticity, immersion. But when the machinery of filmmaking got in the way of that, he reacted like someone whose skin was being peeled. His profanity could rival the best of them. His demands could flatten a production schedule. And his unpredictability made directors tread carefully, always watching for that subtle shift in the air that meant things were about to boil over. But it wasn't ego. It was compulsion. Bates was deeply serious about acting, almost to the point of self-destruction. He gave everything to his roles, and sometimes that meant there wasn't much left for the people around him. They got the aftermath, the tension, the exhaustion, the sharp words that came when the work didn't meet his internal bar. If Bates was the storm, the next man was the aftershock, quieter, shorter, but no less destructive when set off. Ian Holm didn't just act with intensity, he lived it, and sometimes that intensity cracked the walls. 19. Ian Holm. Ian Holm didn't make scenes, he survived them. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flamboyant, but beneath that calm, compact frame was a nervous system wired too tight for comfort. To those who knew him professionally, Holm was a powder keg disguised as a professional. He could be warm, sharp, and even playful. But when he unraveled, it happened fast, and it happened loud. Holm suffered from intense stage fright, crippling even, and that fear didn't always stay inside. There were moments on set and in rehearsal when the pressure built to such a degree that he'd explode, often with very little warning. Colleagues described sudden shouting matches, shaking fits, and outbursts that seemed to shock even Holm himself. The work mattered to him, too much perhaps. And when the fragile balance tipped, he reacted not with calm correction, but with sheer panic laced with fury. Unlike others on this list, Holm didn't lash out from arrogance. He lashed out from fear, from the unbearable tension of trying to stay composed while his insides were screaming. He once confessed in interviews that the thing he hated most about acting was doing it in front of people. And yet, that's where his brilliance lived, on the knife's edge between performance and collapse. Despite his volatility, people rooted for him. There was something heartbreaking in his outbursts, as if each one chipped away at a man trying very hard to hold himself together. But none of that made him easier to work with. The intensity was always there, simmering under the surface, and sets had to be managed accordingly, quietly, carefully, with exits in sight. If Holm was a man shaken by his own genius, the next name on the list was the opposite, a towering figure of confidence and chaos who entered every room like it was already a battlefield and every line was a war cry. 20. Peter Finch. Peter Finch had presence like a punch to the chest. Charisma, intensity, rage, he didn't ration them. He arrived with the energy of a man already mid-argument, and if you weren't ready, you were going to get flattened. Unlike others who brooded or simmered, Finch erupted constantly, without hesitation. And if you were in the blast zone, your job became surviving the day. Finch's reputation was built on more than a handful of bad tempers. He was known throughout the industry for his unpredictability. He could go from a hearty laugh to a venomous tirade in minutes, often triggered by incompetence, delays, or anything resembling bureaucracy. And when the rage came, it didn't trickle. It flooded, shouting, cursing, throwing objects across the room. He didn't play difficult. He was difficult. But here's the twist. Everyone still wanted him. Directors, producers, actors. Because when Finch was on, there was no one better. His performances had the intensity of a man burning from the inside out. And in many ways, he was. He didn't act as much as he fought his way through scenes, throwing emotion like punches, always chasing some elusive truth just beyond the frame. What made Finch so volatile was the same thing that made him extraordinary. He couldn't fake it. Everything had to be real, raw, earned. And if the environment didn't meet that standard, he'd tear it down until it did, or until someone made him leave. There was no in-between. Working with Finch was like building a sandcastle next to a tide that didn't care. And just when you thought the industry couldn't handle any more volume, profanity, or theatrical aggression, in came a man who somehow managed to be louder, brasher, and more unapologetically himself than all of them put together. 21. Brian Blessed, early career. Before Brian Blessed became everyone's favorite bear hug in human form, he was an absolute unit of chaos. Loud doesn't begin to cover it. In his early career, Blessed was a booming, bellowing force of nature, part Shakespeare, part freight train, and reportedly, part waking nightmare for anyone who needed peace and quiet on set. He wasn't cruel like Olivier or icy like Guinness, but he was overwhelming. Crew members remembered him as physically imposing, constantly shouting, even in casual conversation, and prone to bursts of profanity so operatic they bordered on performance art. Not malicious necessarily, just completely unfiltered. If something annoyed him, everyone within a city block knew about it. If something delighted him, same volume, same profanity. He had no off switch. Blessed charged through scenes, conversations, even lunch breaks with the energy of a man chasing his own echo. For younger actors, he could be inspiring or completely exhausting. One minute, he was reciting Latin while punching the air. The next, he was yelling at a lighting technician for destroying the entire mood of Jupiter. Half of it was probably theater. The other half probably wasn't. The thing is, Blessed meant well. He just didn't seem to understand or care that other people needed space, quiet, or breaks. Sets became his stage. Rehearsals became his arena. If you were tired, that was your problem. If you were intimidated, all the better. It meant you were paying attention. Blessed would later mellow, becoming the lovable boom of British television. But in those early days, working with him was like being in a constant stage fight, with no safe word. And so, from Reed to Blessed, we close the curtain not on neat resolutions, but on noise, genius, and the beautiful wreckage of men who could act like gods and curse like sailors.